New York City, steel and glass reaching for the clouds, cars honking, people rushing, and somewhere between noise and power, a woman the world didn't see. Her name was Amina Khalil. To most, she was just the cleaning lady, quiet, modest, invisible. She moved through marble floors and glass offices like a shadow, mopping away the footprints of men who thought themselves untouchable. But Amina carried something no one there did, a language born from survival, and a past the world had forgotten. That morning the office buzzed louder than usual. The CEO, Richard Collins, was preparing for one of the biggest meetings of his career. Investors from the Middle East, men who could multiply his empire overnight, were arriving within the hour. Everything had to look perfect. The floors, the view, the illusion of control. "Make sure the conference room smells like success," Richard said with a smirk, tossing his coat on a chair. His assistant forced a laugh. "Yes, sir." Amina was already there, polishing the glass table so clear it reflected the skyline. She kept her head down, listening to them talk about numbers that didn't include people like her. When the elevator chimed, the air changed. 3 men stepped out, tall, poised, dressed in flowing robes and dark suits. Their presence carried silence, the kind that demands respect. Richard walked forward, his grin wide. "Gentlemen, welcome to New York." They nodded politely, exchanging greetings in Arabic. Amina froze, not because of fear, but because of recognition. Their accents, their words, they spoke of kindness, of long journeys, of family, not business. She smiled faintly and whispered under her breath, in their tongue, "May your steps be guided." One of the visitors, the eldest, turned his head slightly, catching her voice. For a split second, their eyes met. A flicker of surprise, then warmth. He smiled, nodded gently, and turned back. Richard noticed none of it, but his assistant did, and so did the intern standing nearby. As the visitors walked toward the conference room, Amina carried her mop and bucket, stepping aside. One intern whispered, "Did you hear her? Was that Arabic?" Another chuckled. What would she know about that? Richard overheard and laughed. He turned toward Amina, tone dripping with condescension. Wait, did I just hear you say something in Arabic?" Amina paused. "Yes, sir, just a greeting." He laughed louder. "A greeting, huh? Well, if you can translate what he just said." He pointed toward one of the investors still speaking with his team. "I'll raise your salary." The room burst into laughter. Even the interns joined in. The joke was clear, because to them, she wasn't capable of anything more than cleaning. Amina's face didn't change. She simply looked at him with quiet dignity and said softly, "I don't need a raise to understand people, sir." The laughter faded a little. Something in her tone carried more weight than her words. But Richard brushed it off. "See? Humble and funny," he said, walking away. The interns followed, still chuckling. Inside the conference room, the meeting began. Charts on screens, coffee poured, and words, so many words, all about power, partnerships, and percentages. Amina continued working quietly in the hallway, wiping fingerprints from the glass walls, listening to pieces of conversation slipping through. The investors spoke respectfully, but something was off. Their interpreter, a young man hired by the company, was struggling. He hesitated often, translating phrases halfway. The tone in the room began to stiffen. Amina could hear it even through the door. The CEO's voice getting sharper, the translator's voice trembling, and then the sound of polite Arabic growing colder. She stopped wiping for a moment, her heart tightening. She knew that sound. It was the sound people made when they were losing trust. Inside, Richard frowned. "What did he just say?" He snapped at the translator. The young man stammered. He said the presentation was very interesting." The eldest visitor looked offended. That wasn't what he said, not even close. The room froze in discomfort. Richard forced a smile and tried to continue, but the tension had already built. He turned to his assistant, whispering through clenched teeth, "Get this translator under control." And then, through the glass door, a voice spoke. Calm, clear, fluent. He said, "We appreciate your presentation, but we had hoped to speak to someone who understands our culture, not just our contracts." Every head turned. Amina stood at the door, her hands folded politely over the cleaning cloth. No arrogance, no fear, just truth. For a moment, no one moved. The investors exchanged looks of disbelief, then recognition. The eldest among them smiled again, the same warmth from before. "You speak Arabic," he said in his native tongue. Amina bowed her head respectfully. "Yes, sir, since I was a child." He smiled broader. "Then maybe you should sit with us." Richard's jaw clenched. He didn't know whether to be angry or embarrassed. The entire room watched as the investors invited Amina inside, pulling up a chair beside them. The translator stepped back, relieved. Richard forced a stiff grin. "Well, let's, continue, shall we?" But the tone had already shifted. The power in that room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the woman everyone had just laughed at. Amina sat quietly, translating their words with grace and precision. She didn't just repeat sentences, she bridged hearts. Her voice softened the edges of business, and soon the conversation began to flow again. The visitors listened. They smiled. They nodded. When the meeting ended, they stood to shake hands. One of them told Richard, "Your translator was good, but your cleaner was exceptional." Richard tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat. Amina just smiled politely. "Would you like me to bring more water before I leave, sir?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes, they carried quiet strength. The meeting ended, but something else had just begun. Outside, as the guests left, Richard stood by the window, watching them thank Amina personally. He didn't speak, didn't even move. He just stared at the woman he'd mocked, now the one they respected most. The laughter from earlier echoed in his mind. And for the first time in his life, it didn't sound like success. It sounded like shame. The air inside the boardroom grew heavier by the minute, the kind of weight that doesn't come from silence, but from pride. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, trying to look in control while his confidence cracked under pressure. The investors sat across the table, polite but colder now. Their smiles were formal, not friendly, their words shorter, sharper, and layered with meaning that the translator was still missing. The young man wiped sweat from his forehead, flipping through notes he didn't understand. Every sentence he translated felt wrong, and everyone knew it. Richard's assistant whispered from behind him, "Sir, the interpreter's losing them." "I can see that," Richard muttered. "Just fix it." "Fix it how?" she whispered back. "You fired the last one for talking too much." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then tell this one to talk better." He smiled at the guests, that forced, nervous grin of someone drowning in his own arrogance. "So, gentlemen, as I was saying," the eldest investor interrupted softly, speaking in Arabic to his companions. His tone was calm, but his eyes carried disappointment. The translator froze again. His voice trembled as he tried to interpret. He said, your presentation was interesting." One of the other investors frowned. "Interesting." He looked at his partner and murmured something that clearly wasn't agreement. Richard chuckled awkwardly. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment, but it wasn't." From the hallway, through the thin glass door, Amina could hear everything. She was wiping down the stainless handles, pretending not to listen, but her heart was pounding. She could hear every mispronounced word, every broken sentence, every opportunity turning into embarrassment. One of the investors spoke again, this time slower, with kindness that only made it worse. He was trying to help. He said in Arabic, "The problem isn't the product, it's the pride in the presentation." The translator hesitated, then said in English, "They are asking about your production schedule." Richard smiled proudly. "Ah, perfect. I knew they'd love it." The investors looked at one another, their patience thinning. Inside the hallway, Amina paused. She closed her eyes and took a breath. She had promised herself she'd never step out of line again. In this country, her job was survival, not speaking, not being seen, but her conscience tugged at her heart. She remembered her father's voice years ago, before the war took everything. Dignity is not about who speaks louder, Amina. It's about who speaks when silence hurts the truth. She turned the handle slowly. The door creaked open, heads turned. Amina stood there again, same uniform, same calm eyes. "Sir," she said gently, "forgive me, but that's not what he said." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" She took a step forward. "He said, the problem isn't your product, but the pride in your presentation." The translator's face went pale. The investors nodded, relieved someone had finally understood them. Richard's fake smile cracked. The arrogance in the room turned to unease. The eldest investor leaned forward, looking at Amina. "You understand Arabic fluently?" "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "I was born near Damascus. I grew up speaking it every day." He smiled. "Your accent, it's perfect." Richard blinked, still processing. He glanced at his team, whispering sharply, "Who hired her?" Amina spoke again, her tone humble. "I work with the cleaning staff, sir. I just overheard, and I didn't want there to be a misunderstanding." The room fell silent. The translator mumbled something about getting water and practically disappeared. For a few seconds, no one knew what to do. It wasn't just the surprise, it was the shame. The woman they'd ignored had just saved the meeting. The eldest investor gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit with us." Amina hesitated. "I don't want to interrupt." But his tone left no room for refusal. "It would be our honor." She sat down quietly. Every move was respectful, deliberate. She wasn't there to prove herself, just to make peace between two worlds that didn't understand each other. The conversation resumed, this time with Amina translating. Her voice was clear, steady, and full of the calm that everyone else had lost. When she spoke for the investors, their tones softened. When she spoke for Richard, their frowns eased. She translated not just the words, but the intent behind them. Within minutes, the tension that had choked the room melted away. Coffee was poured again. Smiles returned. Real conversation began. And in that moment, for the first time since morning, Richard Collins stayed silent because for once, silence was smarter. By the time the meeting ended, the investors were laughing. One of them clapped Richard on the shoulder. "You have a very talented employee," he said warmly. "Take good care of her." Richard forced a laugh. "Yes, of course. She's one of our best." The words tasted like iron in his mouth. As they walked out, the eldest investor turned to Amina and said in Arabic, "God bless you, daughter. You carry grace that men forget to show." She bowed her head. "Thank you, sir. Your words honor me." They smiled at each other, an unspoken understanding between two souls from the same broken world. When the door finally closed, the laughter from the hallway returned. But it wasn't cruel this time. It was relief. The deal had been saved. The investors were impressed. Everyone was happy, except Richard. He stayed seated, staring at the reflection of his own face in the polished table. And behind his reflection, he could still see her, a maid in uniform, who had spoken more truth in 5 minutes than he had in his entire career. He whispered under his breath, "Who are you, really?" But she was already gone, pushing her cart quietly down the hallway, leaving only the echo of Grace behind her. The next morning, the office looked the same glass walls, same polished desks, but something had changed. It wasn't visible yet, but people whispered about it in every corner. The cleaning lady, the one who spoke fluent Arabic, the one who saved the $1 million deal. Her name passed from mouth to mouth, half in awe, half in disbelief. Amina arrived early, as she always did. She tied her hair back, put on her gloves, and started polishing the floor outside the CEO's office. For her, nothing had changed. Work was work. She wasn't there for applause. She was there to keep moving, to keep surviving. But deep down, something in her heart felt lighter, not pride, peace. She remembered her father's words again, spoken years ago under a sky filled with gunfire. When they laugh at you for being small, smile, because God only plants his biggest seeds in humble soil. Inside the conference room, Richard Collins stood staring at the city skyline. He hadn't slept much. The memory of the meeting played over and over in his mind. Her voice, calm, articulate, unwavering, had done more in minutes than he had with years of charm and money. He still couldn't understand how someone like her, someone who cleaned the floors, could command a room like that. It wasn't power, it was presence, and it unsettled him. His assistant walked in, carrying a folder. "Sir, you have another meeting with the investors this afternoon. They requested to continue discussions about the partnership terms." "Good," he said. "We'll use a professional interpreter this time." She hesitated. "Sir, they specifically asked for Amina." Richard turned sharply. "The cleaning lady." "Yes, sir. Their chairman said she understood them better than anyone else in the room." He rubbed his temple, frustration and shame twisting together. "This is ridiculous. She's not qualified for that." His assistant met his eyes. "With respect, sir, she already proved she is." He didn't answer. He just stared at the city again, his own reflection faintly visible in the glass, and behind it, for the first time, a crack in the man he used to be. That afternoon, the investors returned. The mood was different, lighter, familiar. They greeted Amina first, not the CEO. "Amina," the eldest said warmly, "would you please join us again? Your translation was a gift yesterday." She nodded, humbled. "Of course, sir. I'm happy to help." She sat quietly between the two groups, not as an employee, not as a guest, but as a bridge. And once again, the impossible happened. The meeting flowed. The conversation that had once drowned in ego now breathed freely. Amina translated not just the words, but the emotions, the pauses, the humor, the respect. When one of the investors used an Arabic proverb, she smiled and explained its meaning with gentle detail. He said, "The fruit that bends the branch is the one that's ready to give. It means humility makes you fruitful." The room fell silent. Even the American executives looked at one another, realizing they were learning more than language that day. At the end of the meeting, the investors stood, smiling broadly. "You have something rare here," one said to Richard. "A woman who understands not just our tongue, but our hearts." Richard forced a polite smile. "Indeed, we're fortunate." Amina bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I'm just happy I could help." As the guests left, Richard stopped her at the door. "Wait," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" She hesitated. "In school, sir. Back home." "Home." "Syria," she said quietly. "My family fled the war years ago. We came here when I was 22. I studied Arabic literature and teaching, but my degree doesn't count in this country." He blinked. "So you clean floors instead?" She smiled gently. "It's honest work, and sometimes life gives us different classrooms to teach from. Richard didn't respond. He just nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing deeper than he expected. She turned to leave, but before she did, she added softly, "I teach Arabic to some of the cafeteria workers on lunch breaks. They want to communicate better with our clients from the Gulf." He frowned. "You teach? Here?" "Just during lunch. Small lessons. I don't charge them." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Purpose without ego, grace without ambition, humility stronger than pride. That night, when the office emptied, Richard stayed behind. He sat alone in the same room where he'd once laughed at her. Now, that laughter echoed differently, like guilt bouncing off glass walls. He looked at the chair where Amina had sat earlier, translating like she'd been born to. And for the first time in his career, he realized how small power feels when compared to character. He poured himself a drink, but couldn't swallow it. His reflection in the window stared back, cold, tired, hollow. He whispered to no one in particular, "God, what have I become?" The word surprised even him. He hadn't prayed in years, but that night he did. The next morning, before anyone arrived, Richard walked through the empty hallway. The floors gleamed. He saw Amina's cart parked neatly by the elevator. He paused for a long moment, then whispered under his breath, "Thank you for sending her." He wasn't sure who he was talking to, her or heaven itself. Later that day, the company issued a memo. All staff are encouraged to join weekly Arabic cultural sessions. It didn't say who would lead them, but everyone already knew. Amina read the notice while wiping down the conference door. Her lips parted in disbelief. She smiled, small, quiet, the kind of smile that belongs to people who have seen miracles take the long way. She whispered softly, in Arabic, "Subhanallah, glory be to God." And in that moment, for the first time since she'd fled her homeland, she didn't feel like a refugee anymore. She felt like she had finally arrived. It was Friday morning when everything changed again. The company cafeteria buzzed with its usual noise, coffee machines, laughter, phones ringing, but near the far corner, a group of employees sat quietly, listening to a woman they used to overlook. Amina stood by the whiteboard, writing Arabic letters with a marker. Her tone was soft, her smile patient, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had learned to rebuild from ashes. On the board she wrote, "Marhaban," welcome. She pointed at it, then turned to the group. Every culture has a way of saying hello, but in Arabic, this word means more than greeting. It means, "I see you." The workers nodded, taking notes. Some were cafeteria staff, some from the logistics team. Even a few managers had joined in, curious, respectful, a little humbled, and behind the glass wall, watching quietly, was Richard Collins. He'd come down from his office early that morning, pretending to inspect operations, but he wasn't fooling anyone. He just wanted to understand her. He stood there, arms folded, listening as Amina continued teaching. "Language is not only words," she said, "it's memory. When you learn someone's language, you tell them, 'Your story matters enough for me to speak it.'" Her accent danced lightly, Arabic melting into English, pain melting into wisdom. Something in Richard's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or awe, maybe both. When the lesson ended, he waited until everyone had left. Then he stepped inside. Amina turned, surprised. "Good morning, sir." He nodded. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to thank you, for doing this." She smiled. "You don't need to thank me, sir. They asked to learn. I'm just happy to help." He hesitated, then said softly, "You speak like someone who's lived 100 lives." Her eyes grew distant for a moment. "In some ways, maybe I have." He gestured toward a chair. "Would you sit with me for a moment? I'd like to know more about you." She hesitated. This was still her boss, but his tone wasn't commanding this time. It was human. So she sat. For a while, silence filled the space between them. Then Amina spoke. "I was born near Homs, in Syria," she began. "My father was a teacher. He used to read to us every night, poems, scriptures, stories about hope. He said knowledge is a lamp that even war can't blow out." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "When the war came, our house was destroyed. My mother and younger brother didn't make it out. My father and I escaped. We walked for days, hiding, until we reached Lebanon. He got sick there. I came to America alone." She paused, her eyes wet but steady. "For a long time, I thought God had forgotten me. I lost everything, my family, my country, my name. But every time I helped someone, even in small ways, it felt like he whispered, 'I still see you.'" Richard's throat tightened. He'd sat through hundreds of success stories in his career, but never one like this. There was no glamour here, no ego, just truth. Amina continued quietly. "When I arrived, I had a degree in education, but no papers that counted here. So I cleaned. At first, I was ashamed. Then one day, I remembered what my father said, that every job becomes sacred when done with honesty." She smiled faintly. "So I started cleaning like I was polishing a future I couldn't see yet." Richard's eyes glistened. He looked down at his hands that had signed million-dollar deals, but couldn't remember the last time they'd helped someone without reward. He whispered, almost to himself, "You've done more good mopping these floors than I have running this company?" Amina shook her head. "No, sir, we just serve in different ways. The only difference is who we're serving." Her words hit like scripture. He looked up, meeting her eyes. They were calm, forgiving, the kind that disarmed every defense a man could build. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Your skills, your degree, your story?" Amina smiled softly. "Because not everyone listens until they're ready, and sometimes silence teaches louder than words." He exhaled slowly, his pride peeling away like old paint. "I think I was one of those people." She smiled again, her voice gentle. "Maybe. But God finds ways to humble us, not to hurt us, to heal us." At that moment, the door opened slightly. Sarah, the assistant, peeked in. "Mr. Collins, the investors called again. They want to schedule another meeting, and they specifically asked if Amina would attend." He smiled faintly. "Of course they did." Sarah smiled back and left, closing the door softly behind her. Richard turned to Amina. "You've changed this place more in 1 week than I have in 20 years. She looked at him, almost embarrassed. "I didn't change anything, sir. Truth did. People just needed to hear it in a language their hearts understood." He stood up slowly. "You said you teach the cafeteria staff Arabic at lunch." "Yes." "Would you consider teaching the rest of us?" Amina blinked, surprised. "The executives?" He nodded. "Yes, all of us. Myself included." Her smile widened, gentle and incredulous. "If that's what you really want, sir, I'll do my best." Richard exhaled, like a man finally free from himself. "Good, because I think I'm finally ready to listen." That afternoon, he sent an email to the entire company. New initiative, Arabic Language and Cultural Program, led by Ms. Amina Khalil attendance, mandatory for all executives and department heads. Within minutes, messages flooded his inbox. Confused, curious, but none of them dared to question it. A week later, the first class was full. Men and women in suits sat quietly, notebooks open, and at the front of the room stood the same woman who once swept crumbs under their tables. Amina smiled as she began. "Today, we start with a simple word, salam. It means peace. And peace begins when we finally see each other." Behind her, on the whiteboard, she wrote a second word, smaller, almost hidden. Rama. Compassion. As she underlined it, the camera of life zoomed out from the classroom to the office to the city skyline. The same building that once echoed with laughter at her expense now echoed with her voice, a voice of understanding, forgiveness, and quiet power. That night, New York didn't sleep. The city glowed like it always did, headlights weaving through rain, towers blinking against clouds. But in one high-rise office, the light still burned long after everyone else had gone home. Richard Collins sat alone at his desk. The skyline stretched out before him like an empire he no longer recognized. On his monitor, the company's quarterly numbers flickered. Millions gained, millions spent, but none of it meant anything now, not after what he'd heard that day. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie, his thoughts echoing louder than the city outside. He'd spent his entire life chasing validation, the kind that came with handshakes, signatures, and names engraved in gold on glass doors. But the sound that haunted him now wasn't applause. It was a woman's calm voice saying, "God humbles us, not to hurt us, but to heal us." He rubbed his temples, the sentence looping in his mind like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. On the corner of his desk sat the memo, Arabic Cultural Program, led by Amina Khalil. He picked it up, reading it again and again. It was his idea, but somehow it didn't feel like it came from him. He whispered quietly, "I just wanted to fix an image, but she fixed something in me instead." The words hit harder than he expected. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Collins felt small, and strangely, that smallness felt like relief. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. Rain streaked down the glass, each drop catching the glow of streetlights like tiny falling stars. He remembered Amina's story, her father, her family, her flight from war. And then he remembered his own father, a preacher in a small Ohio town, a man who used to say, "Son, God's richest lessons come wrapped in humiliation." Richard had left those words behind decades ago, trading faith for fortune. But now, under the rain-soaked glow of the city, those forgotten lessons came flooding back. He walked over to his cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was an old Bible, leather cracked, edges torn. His father's handwriting still marked the margins. He brushed off the dust and opened it. A page fell loose, with a verse underlined in faded ink. "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." He closed his eyes. For a long time, he just stood there, the city humming below, the verse ringing above. And then, quietly, he prayed. Not the kind of prayer that demands or negotiates, but the kind that confesses. "God," he whispered, "I mocked someone you sent to teach me. I called wisdom worthless because it wore a uniform. I thought I was leading this company, but all this time, I was the one who needed leading." His voice cracked. "I don't deserve her forgiveness, but if you can give her grace, teach me how to give it too." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office before sunrise. The building was still dark. Only the janitorial lights glowed faintly across the marble floor. Down the hall, he saw Amina's cart. She was kneeling, cleaning a corner that no one ever noticed. He hesitated, then approached quietly. "Amina," he said softly. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Collins, you're here early?" He nodded. "Couldn't sleep." She smiled gently. "Then maybe you needed to pray." He blinked, startled. "How did you—" She shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the eyes of the tired look like the eyes of the lost. I've seen both." He smiled faintly. "You really don't miss anything, do you?" She stood, wringing the cloth in her hands. "I used to miss everything that mattered. Now I try not to." He took a deep breath. I came to say I'm sorry. She froze, the mop still in her hand. Sorry. For the way I treated you, for laughing, for seeing you as less than me when you're everything I should have been trying to be. Her expression softened, but her silence spoke louder than words. He continued, voice low. When you translated in that meeting, I thought you were showing off. Now I realize you were serving, and I mistook humility for weakness. She smiled gently. Humility isn't weakness, sir. It's strength without noise. He nodded slowly. You said once that every job can be sacred. I didn't understand that before. It's simple, she said. When your work is done for something greater than yourself, it becomes worship. He exhaled deeply. I think I'm finally starting to see that. She looked at him kindly. Then you've already started to change. Later that day, Richard called an all-staff meeting. Executives, managers, assistants. Everyone filled the conference room. He stood at the front, not with his usual confidence, but with quiet sincerity. I've built this company on numbers, he began, on ambition. But recently, I was reminded that without humility, growth means nothing. He turned toward Amina, who stood at the back, still in her uniform. I want you all to know about the woman who reminded me of that. He gestured for her to come forward. Reluctantly, she did. The entire room watched, unsure what was happening. This, Richard said, is Amina Khalil. She came to this country with nothing but courage and faith, and because of her, we didn't just save a deal, we saved our integrity. A soft murmur spread through the room. He smiled faintly. From today forward, she's no longer part of the cleaning staff. She's joining our leadership team as head of Arabic language and cultural development. A gasp, then applause, hesitant at first, then warm, genuine. Amina looked stunned. Sir, I don't know what to say. He nodded. Just keep doing what you've already been doing, teaching us what really matters. That night, after everyone left, Richard sat in his office again, but this time he wasn't alone. On his desk sat two things, a new contract with the investors and an old Bible, now open. He smiled, whispering quietly, Thank you for sending her to clean more than the floors. And for the first time in years, he felt clean too. The next Monday morning felt different, not louder, not busier, just cleaner, not the kind of clean you see, but the kind you feel. The hallways that once echoed with shallow laughter now carried quiet greetings and softer tones. The people who used to walk past the cleaning staff without seeing them now nodded, smiled, even said, "Good morning." And at the center of it all was a woman who still wore the same uniform, because she wasn't ready to let go of where she came from. Amina arrived before sunrise, as she always did, but instead of her usual cart and bucket, she carried a small folder, her teaching notes. The company had converted one of the old meeting rooms into a new training center. A sign by the door read, Arabic Language and Cultural Class, Instructor Amina Khalil. The first session was meant for the executives. Most of them showed up out of obligation, men and women in suits, holding coffee cups and skepticism. But Amina greeted each one with a smile that disarmed excuses. Good morning, she said, or as we say in Arabic, Sabah al-Khair. They repeated it awkwardly. She laughed softly. Not at them, with them. Perfect. You're already better than you think. Richard sat in the back, quietly observing. For the first time, he wasn't the one talking. He was the one learning. Amina began the class with something unexpected. Instead of grammar or vocabulary, she wrote 3 words on the board: respect, patience, honor. These are not just Arabic words, she said. They are bridges. If you learn them here, you'll speak them everywhere, in every language. One executive raised a hand. Miss Khalil, do you really think language can change business? Amina smiled. No, sir, but it can change people, and people change business. The room went quiet. Someone actually put down their phone. She moved through the lessons slowly, teaching greetings, expressions, and gestures, but between the lines, she was teaching humanity. When one student mispronounced a phrase, she didn't correct him sharply. She told him a story instead. In my country, when a child says a word wrong, the teacher smiles and says, "Try again," because even mistakes sound beautiful when spoken with effort. Laughter filled the room, real this time, not nervous, not arrogant, real. Even Richard smiled, writing notes for the first time in years. By lunchtime, the class had learned a dozen words, but more importantly, they'd learned humility. One manager approached Amina afterward. "Ma'am, I never thought I'd say this, but I think I enjoyed learning more in 1 hour with you than in 4 years of business school." She chuckled. "That's because this class isn't about success, it's about connection." He nodded, thoughtful. "Maybe that's what we've been missing." Later that afternoon, Amina returned to her old cleaning route, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She passed the break room, where 2 interns whispered and quickly stood up. She smiled. "It's all right," she said. "You can sit. I'm not your boss." One of them blushed. We didn't know what to say." Amina laughed softly. "Then start with thank you. It works in every language." They laughed too, relieved by her grace. Meanwhile, in his office upstairs, Richard watched the CCTV feed on his monitor, not as surveillance, but as a reminder of how far they'd come. He saw her walking through the halls, people greeting her like a respected colleague, not a background character. He smiled and whispered to himself, "That's what leadership looks like." Then he looked at his own reflection in the dark window. For the first time in years, he didn't see a man trying to win. He saw a man trying to learn. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Employees started using Arabic greetings in emails. They began hosting cultural lunches, inviting team members from different backgrounds to share stories. Productivity rose. Turnover dropped. But most importantly, the air inside the company shifted from competition to compassion. It wasn't policy, it was influence. One woman's humility had rewritten the company's culture without a single memo. One afternoon, Richard called Amina into his office. She looked nervous, unsure why she'd been summoned. "Please, sit," he said. She obeyed, clutching her folder. He smiled warmly. "I wanted to show you something." He turned his monitor toward her, a bar graph, glowing in blue. Employee satisfaction, up 47%. Partnership renewals, up 30%. Internal complaints, down by half. She blinked. "That's good, right?" He chuckled. "That's more than good. That's miraculous. And it all started when you opened your mouth in that meeting." She shook her head modestly. "No, sir. It started when you opened your heart afterward." He paused, her words lingering in the quiet. Then he said softly, "You were right about something else too." "What's that?" "You said every job can be sacred." She smiled. "And now you believe it?" He nodded. "I do, because I finally started doing mine with purpose." A week later, Amina's classes became a permanent part of the company's training program. They weren't just about Arabic anymore. They included empathy, teamwork, and faith in action. Even the cafeteria staff attended, learning side by side with executives. And once a week, after everyone had gone home, Amina would stay behind, sitting in the quiet classroom, writing new lessons for the next day. She always ended her notes with the same words, scribbled at the bottom of the page. "Teach hearts first. Words will follow." As the months passed, her influence reached beyond the office walls. A local newspaper wrote an article titled, "From Janitor to Teacher, How Humility Changed a Company." When Richard read it, he didn't feel proud of his name mentioned in it. He felt grateful for hers. He called Amina into his office again. "There's something you should know," he said. "Since you started teaching here, our partners from the Middle East have offered to sponsor a scholarship fund in your name." Her eyes widened. "In my name?" He nodded. "They said it's for refugees, people who remind them of you." Tears welled up. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Richard smiled softly. "You see, Amina, you didn't just teach us a language. You reminded us of humanity." That evening, as she left the office, the sunset painted the city gold. She looked up at the tall glass tower she once cleaned, now glowing with warmth. She whispered quietly, "Thank you, God, for turning laughter into light. The world has a way of spinning back toward truth, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And when it does, it makes sure everyone sees the difference between pride and purpose." For Amina Khalil, that moment arrived 6 months later. It started with a single article. A journalist from the New York Herald who had heard whispers about the cleaning lady who became a language teacher. She came to the office expecting a cliché success story. She left in tears. Her article went viral within days. The headline read, "Grace in Translation, How a Refugee Taught a Company to Speak Humanity." The story spread across the country, then across oceans. News outlets called, non-profits reached out. Churches, mosques, schools, everyone wanted to meet the woman who turned humiliation into honor. One morning, when Amina arrived for work, she found the lobby filled with flowers, letters, and thank you notes from strangers, cards from children learning Arabic, messages from refugees saying she gave them hope. Even letters from soldiers stationed overseas, thanking her for reminding them that faith still crosses borders. She stood frozen, eyes glistening, until the receptionist smiled. "They've been arriving all week," she said. "Looks like you've started something, Ms. Khalil." Amina laughed softly. "I didn't start anything. God just recycled my pain into purpose." That afternoon, Richard called her into his office. When she walked in, there were cameras, reporters, and a small film crew. He smiled gently. "I should have warned you. They're filming a documentary about leadership, and you're the main story." Amina blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "Yes, the world's heard about what happened here. They want to know how one woman changed everything without shouting, without fighting, just by being faithful." She smiled shyly. "I didn't change anything, sir. I just refused to let humiliation make me bitter." The interview began. A reporter asked, "Ms. Khalil, when you were laughed at that day in the meeting, did you ever imagine you'd be here now, being celebrated by the same people?" Amina thought for a moment. Then she said softly, "I didn't imagine it, because I didn't need to. I wasn't working for their approval. I was working for peace in my heart, and peace always finds its way home." The reporter smiled through tears. "You lost so much. Your family, your country. How do you keep believing in people after everything?" Amina's eyes softened. "Because someone once believed in me when I didn't deserve it. God. If He can forgive, who am I to stop trying?" The room went silent. Even the camera crew lowered their eyes. Later that week, the company hosted a ceremony to honor her officially. Employees filled the main atrium, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the woman they once walked past without a word. Richard took the stage first. He looked out at the crowd and began, "6 months ago, I laughed at someone who was better than me." The room went completely still. He continued, voice firm but humble. "I mocked her because I thought power meant position. but she showed me that power means presence, and real leadership means serving, not standing above. He turned toward Amina, who stood beside him, hands folded. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the best teacher I've ever had." Applause thundered through the room. Some people cried, some clapped until their hands hurt, and Amina just stood there smiling quietly, the way only truly humble people do when heaven finally catches up to earth. When it was her turn to speak, she took the microphone, but for a long moment said nothing. She just looked around the room, at faces that once looked through her, now looking up to her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "I came to this country with nothing but a broken heart and a borrowed name. I thought my life was over. But God doesn't throw broken things away. He rebuilds them." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "Some of you laughed at me once, and that's okay. Because if you hadn't, I might never have learned how powerful forgiveness can be." Tears streamed quietly through the audience. Even Richard looked away, wiping his eyes. She smiled softly. "The world teaches us that dignity comes from titles. But I learned that dignity comes from truth, from knowing who you are, even when others forget it." When she finished, the crowd stood in applause. The noise was overwhelming, but her piece was louder. Reporters swarmed afterward, microphones flashing. One asked, "Ms. Khalil, what do you plan to do next?" She smiled. "I'm going to keep teaching, not just language, compassion, because when people learn to listen, they learn to love." That evening, long after the cameras were gone, Amina sat alone in the quiet classroom she had built. The city lights shimmered outside, reflected faintly on the whiteboard where she'd written a verse earlier. "He raises the humble and brings down the proud." She traced the words with her finger, then whispered softly in Arabic, "Alhamdulillah." Praise be to God. Meanwhile, Richard stood by the window of his office, looking down at the same woman who once mopped his floor. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Some angels don't need wings. They just need a reason to speak." Weeks later, the board approved her new title officially, Director of Arabic Education and Cultural Development. Her salary multiplied tenfold, but her pride didn't move an inch. When asked how she planned to celebrate Keys, she laughed. "I'll do what I've always done, help others find their voice." And she did. Every week, she hosted lunch sessions for employees who wanted to learn Arabic, teaching them not just words, but meaning, stories of kindness, patience, and faith. And one day, when a new intern asked her, "Ms. Khalil, what's the secret to your success?" she smiled, eyes warm, and replied, "The secret is no secret. Be kind when the world is cruel. Be faithful when the world doubts. And remember, sometimes the greatest promotion comes after the greatest humiliation." Time passed, but Amina's light didn't fade. If anything, it grew, slowly, quietly, like dawn breaking over the horizon. She no longer carried a mop and bucket, but she still walked the same halls with the same calm steps, the same gentle smile, the same whispered prayer at the start of every day. People had changed around her, but she hadn't forgotten where her strength came from. Humility was still her uniform. Gratitude was still her badge. Her classroom was full every week. Executives, interns, cafeteria workers, janitors, they all sat together now. No ranks, no titles, no ego, just people learning the language of understanding. "Let's start with a simple phrase," she said one day. "Shukran." The room repeated in unison, their voices soft but sincere. "Shukran. It means thank you," she explained, "but in Arabic it carries more heart. It means I see the kindness you gave me, and I honor it." Her words hung in the air. You could almost feel the room breathing differently. After class, Richard approached her with a quiet smile. "Still making miracles, I see." She laughed lightly. "No, sir, just teaching people to listen. He nodded. That's the same thing. Then he handed her a folder. What's this? She asked. Your idea, he said. The scholarship program. Her eyes widened. Mine? Yes, the investors loved it. It's called the Khalil Initiative. We'll sponsor 50 refugees a year. Full education, full support. They'll learn English, business and Arabic to become translators, teachers and ambassadors. The world needs more bridges like you. Tears filled her eyes. 50 lives, she whispered. He smiled. 50 to start. But knowing you, it'll turn into 5,000. News spread quickly. Companies across the city began reaching out, asking Amina to speak about cross-cultural leadership. At first, she refused, too humble, too unsure. But Richard insisted. You're not promoting yourself, he said. You're spreading a message the world needs to hear. So she agreed, and within months, she was standing on stages she used to clean beneath. At a leadership summit in Washington, Amina stood before hundreds of CEOs, all waiting for some formula for success. But she didn't talk about profit margins or market shares. She told them about a broom. When I came to this country, she began, the only thing anyone trusted me with was a mop. So I cleaned, not because I was small, but because it was the only way I knew to keep something pure. The audience listened, silent. Then one day, I realized something. We're all cleaners. Some of us clean floors, some clean numbers, some clean our names, but only a few clean hearts, and that's the kind that changes the world. The room erupted in applause. Executives wiped tears they didn't expect. And for a brief moment, ambition bowed to grace. Her story reached international headlines again. From refugee to teacher. How one woman rebuilt faith in business. Major networks called. Universities requested her as a guest lecturer. Nonprofits named her Humanitarian of the Year. But Amina never let the titles touch her spirit. When reporters asked what her secret was, she always gave the same answer. I never stopped being grateful, even when life gave me nothing to hold but faith. Back at the company, a new plaque was placed in the main lobby. It read, "To those who believe kindness has no place in business, meet the woman who proved otherwise." Underneath, a quote from Amina, "Success is measured not by what you build, but by what you lift." Employees began calling it the Wall of Grace. Visitors stopped to take pictures, but for Amina, it was just another reminder that humility travels further than pride. One afternoon, during her lunch break, she sat in the courtyard reading letters from scholarship students overseas, handwritten notes in English, Arabic and broken Spanish, all saying the same thing, "You gave me a future." She pressed one to her chest and whispered, "Thank you, God, for letting me be a bridge." At that moment, she felt a familiar presence, like her father's hand on her shoulder. And in her heart, she heard his voice again, "You see, my daughter, even a lamp in a small room can light an entire house." That evening, Richard found her in the classroom, erasing the whiteboard after another long day. He stood quietly for a moment, watching. "You never stop, do you?" he said. She smiled. "There's still work to do." He nodded. "Always will be. But I wanted to tell you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a check. She frowned. "Sir, I don't need more money." "It's not a bonus," he said. "It's a donation, in your name, to build a language center for refugees. It'll be part of our company's foundation." Amina's lips trembled. "A whole center?" He smiled. "With classrooms, childcare, and training for teachers, you taught me that faith doesn't stay in words. It builds walls, roofs, and doors." She covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. "God bless you, Mr. Collins." He shook his head. "No, God blessed me the day you walked into my meeting." That night, As she locked up, the city lights shimmered against the windows. Her reflection stared back, no longer the invisible cleaner, no longer the refugee hiding behind survival. Now she was a teacher, a leader, a living miracle. She touched her reflection gently and whispered in Arabic, "You are seen. You are loved. You are free." And with that, she turned off the lights, leaving the glow of her faith to illuminate what she had built. In less than a year, her salary had grown tenfold, but her humility stayed priceless. Because true wealth, she often said, wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives healed, hearts lifted, and bridges built. And in that sense, Amina Khalil was the richest woman in New York. A year had passed, but for Amina, time didn't feel like a countdown anymore. It felt like a blessing measured in moments of peace. The city that once frightened her now welcomed her with open streets. She had become part of its rhythm. Not the noise, but the harmony beneath it. Everywhere she went, people greeted her. Employees, neighbors, even strangers who recognized her from the stories. But she never saw herself as a symbol, just a servant who was allowed to shine for a little while. One bright afternoon, she stood at the entrance of a new building in Queens. The sign above the door read, "The Khalil Language and Hope Center." It was real, concrete, glass and grace, built from dreams and donations. Inside were classrooms filled with refugees, immigrants, and families learning English and Arabic together. Children laughed, teachers smiled. And on every wall hung the same phrase in both languages, "Peace begins when we finally listen." Amina walked through the halls slowly, running her fingers along the freshly painted walls. Each room was a prayer answered. She stopped in one of the smaller classrooms. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, sat drawing at her desk. When she noticed Amina, she jumped up and ran to her. "Miss Amina!" "Look!" The girl held up her drawing, a woman cleaning floors, and behind her a golden light shining through a window. Amina smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's beautiful. Who is she?" The girl answered without hesitation. "It's my mom. She cleans houses, but I told her one day she'll be a teacher like you." Amina knelt down, touched the girl's cheek and whispered, "Tell her she already is." That evening, the center held its official opening ceremony. Dozens of guests attended, investors, community leaders, and people whose lives Amina had touched. Richard Collins stood by the podium, smiling like a proud brother. When it was his turn to speak, he began with words no one expected from a CEO. "Success used to mean growth, profit, expansion," he said. "But then I met a woman who taught me that success means compassion, humility, and grace." He paused, looking at Amina. "I mocked her once, and she forgave me. Then she taught me the one thing business school never did, how to serve." Applause rippled through the crowd. Some clapped, some cried, some simply nodded because they understood. When it was Amina's turn to speak, she stood behind the podium, hands trembling slightly. "I used to believe that silence kept me safe," she began, "but I've learned that silence can also keep the world empty. So today, I speak not to be heard, but to give thanks." She looked out over the audience. "I thank this country for giving me a chance to rebuild. I thank my father, who taught me that education is light. And I thank God, because every closed door he allowed was only leading me to this one." She paused, letting the emotion breathe. Then she smiled. "People ask me if I've forgiven those who laughed at me that day. I tell them, yes, because grace sounds better in every language." The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered. Tears shimmered under the lights. But Amina didn't look at the cameras or the crowd. Her eyes lifted quietly toward the ceiling, as if she were thanking someone unseen, and maybe she was. After the ceremony, Amina stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city glowed with life. Car lights, shop signs, children playing in the distance. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that calm, she could almost hear her mother's voice, soft and steady, saying, "You kept the lamp burning, my daughter." A tear slipped down her cheek, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. A week later, she returned to the company headquarters, not as an employee, but as a guest speaker for the new hires. The same boardroom where she once mopped floors now carried her name on a plaque, the Amina Khalil Conference Hall. She smiled, shaking her head. "God," she whispered, "you really do have a sense of humor." When the new employees arrived, she greeted them warmly. "Welcome," she said. "This company has many rules, but I only want you to remember one. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They might speak the language of miracles." Months later, life settled into rhythm again. Her classes continued, her center grew, and the seeds she planted kept multiplying in ways even she didn't see. One evening, she received a letter from a young man overseas. It read, "Dear Miss Khalil, I was one of the refugees your scholarship helped. I'm now teaching English to children in Jordan. Every time I see them smile, I remember your story. You taught me that when life silences you, teach anyway." Amina pressed the letter to her heart. She looked out the window at the city lights and whispered in Arabic, "Alhamdulillah. Thank you, God." The years ahead would bring new challenges. Wars, politics, losses and victories, but Amina faced them all the same way she faced that first day, with dignity, with peace, and with faith. Because some people chase success, others chase meaning, but the rare ones, and the truly chosen ones, create light for others to walk by, and Amina Khalil had become that light. She came as a refugee, she worked as a cleaner, she was mocked, ignored and underestimated. But when the moment came, her faith spoke louder than pride, her humility higher than status, and her forgiveness deeper than power. They laughed at her once. Now the world listens in her language. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They might speak the language of miracles. Some stories end when the applause fades. Others begin there. Amina Khalil's story didn't end in that conference room, nor in the hall named after her, nor even in the center that bore her name. It lived on, in every person who walked through those doors and learned that humility isn't weakness, and kindness isn't naivety. They are strength and wisdom, spoken softly, yet heard forever. Years later, when the company celebrated its 50th anniversary, Richard Collins, now retired, stood at the back of the same auditorium where Amina once gave her first speech. He watched as a new generation took the stage, young, hopeful, diverse, speaking 3 languages fluently, English, Arabic, and compassion. Behind them hung a banner with her quote, now carved into the company's legacy, "Never underestimate the quiet ones, they might speak the language of miracles." Richard smiled faintly, whispering to himself, she was right. She always was. He still kept her first Arabic notebook in his drawer, the one she used when she began teaching. On the last page, in her delicate handwriting, she had written, "Grace is not taught. It's remembered." Somewhere across the city, the Khalil Language and Hope Center still glowed late into the night. Inside, children recited words in Arabic and English, their laughter echoing through the hallways she built. On one wall, a framed photograph showed Amina standing beside a small girl, the same girl who once said her mother was a cleaner. Now, that girl was one of the teachers. And under the picture, a simple inscription read, "She didn't just teach us to speak, she taught us to understand." Outside, the streets of Queens shimmered with neon lights, and the city that once made her feel invisible now whispered her name in 1,000 unseen ways, in classrooms, in homes, in boardrooms, in every act of quiet courage. Because when grace enters a place, it never leaves the same way it came. It multiplies, it lingers, it redeems, As the night deepened, a janitor at the center turned off the last light. Before locking up, she paused for a moment, looked at Amina's picture, and whispered softly, "Shukran." "Thank you." Then she smiled, the same kind of smile Amina once carried, humble, peaceful, unshaken. And somewhere beyond the noise of the city, beneath the stars that had guided her across oceans and through wars, Amina's spirit remained, not as a hero, but as a reminder that God can turn a whisper into a witness, that the smallest voice can echo across empires, that the one who was mocked in silence can become the one who teaches the world to listen. Thinking message for your life today. Every generation leaves behind monuments of power, buildings, empires, fortunes, but only a few leave behind monuments of grace. She came to clean floors, but she ended up cleansing hearts. And in the end, her life became a translation, from pain to purpose, from silence to song, from earth to eternity. Grace in every language, faith in every word, and love in every life she touched. Subscribe on channel and enjoy more stories next days.